The dust tasted like rust and burning wire. Private First Class Leah Hart pressed her back against the crumbling stone wall at the southern end of Ember Ridge and listened to the sound of Alpha Platoon dying by degrees. She had been in this country for 41 days. She had spent 39 of those days cataloging supply manifests, cross-referencing ammunition counts, and organizing fuel requisitions in a corrugated tin building 11 kilometers behind the forward operating base. She was not a soldier by any obvious measure. She wore no combat patches on her shoulders. She carried a standard-issue M4 carbine she had never once fired in the field. The other soldiers in the platoon had stopped registering her existence somewhere around day 12. She was the clerk, the quiet one, the girl who sat in the back corner and filled out forms in handwriting so precise it looked machine-printed. That was what they saw. That was all they had bothered to see. Before we go any further into this story, drop a comment right now and let us know where you are watching from. Because what you are about to hear is the kind of story that deserves to be witnessed. And your presence here matters. The morning had started at 5:47 when Sergeant First Class Marcus Donovan had ordered the platoon's 28 soldiers into 3 armored carriers for what was supposed to be a four-hour reconnaissance sweep through the valley corridor north of Kasha. Donovan was 39 years old, built like a man who had been compressed under enormous pressure for a long time and had simply refused to break. He had served 3 previous tours in this theater. He had a daughter in Savannah, Georgia, whose school drawings he kept folded inside the top flap of his left chest pocket. He was the kind of commander who remembered every soldier's name and the names of their siblings, because he believed that a man who was known completely was a man who felt he had something worth surviving for. The sweep had turned into an ambush at 8:14, 6 kilometers north of the last checkpoint, when the leading carrier detonated a pressure plate device buried beneath 4 to 7 centimeters of packed gravel and sand. The explosion had killed Corporal Devin Rashid immediately and wounded 4 others. Before the dust had settled from that first blast, enemy gunfire had opened from 3 elevated positions simultaneously. The rocky ridgeline to the northwest at approximately 380 meters, a destroyed agricultural building at 240 meters to the east, and a dense tree line at 510 meters to the south-southwest. Donovan had pulled his people into the ruins of what had once been a small stone settlement at the edge of the ridge. Stone walls, collapsed rooftops, a courtyard choked with dead vegetation and fractured clay brick. Cover, but barely. Concealment, but barely. And then the situation had worsened in a way that seemed almost deliberate, almost insulting. The radio specialist, Corporal Antoine Webb, had taken a fragment from the second burst of fire that shattered both his primary radio unit and the emergency backup handset mounted to the carrier's rear compartment. The satellite uplink device had burned with the second carrier, which had taken an RPG round through its left side panel at 8:22. A support task to this sector was 4 to 7 minutes away at minimum, according to the last transmission received before the equipment failed. The enemy force was estimated at between 84 and 91 fighters based on the volume and distribution of incoming fire. Alpha Platoon had 27 functional soldiers remaining, 11 of whom had varying degrees of wounds from the first 2 exchanges. They were pinned. They were isolated. And the enemy was moving. Sergeant Donovan counted his ammunition, his people, and his options. All 3 numbers were smaller than he needed them to be. He moved along the inside of the southern wall, staying low, touching each soldier on the shoulder as he passed, not because there was something to say, but because the touch itself meant something. Private Hector Villanueva, 19 years old from Laredo, Texas, was pressed against the wall with his M249 light machine gun and a face so controlled it looked made of ceramic. Private Second Class Tanya Osei was treating Corporal Webb's arm wound with one hand and holding her rifle with the other, her jaw set in a line that permitted no argument from the situation. Specialist Finn Calloway was feeding a belt through the gun and counting rounds without needing to look at his hands. These were Donovan's people. He knew every one of them the way a man knows the rooms of the house he grew up in. He reached the far end of the south wall. The person he found there was not what he expected to find. Private First Class Leah Hart sat with her back against the wall and her eyes level with a narrow crack between 2 stones, approximately 12 millimeters wide, through which she was observing something outside with an expression of quiet and absolute concentration. She was not afraid. Donovan had learned to read fear the way other people read weather. Fear had a texture, a particular stillness that was not calm but was the absence of any movement that might attract consequence. What he saw on Leah Hart's face was not that. What he saw was something far more difficult to name. Calculation. The slow, patient sorting of variables. She had a pack between her knees. Not her standard issue field pack. A separate, longer case of matte black polymer with reinforced aluminum corners that Donovan had never seen before. He crouched beside her. "Hart, you all right?" She did not look at him. "3 separate firing positions," she said. Her voice was level and quiet and not at all the voice of a logistics clerk. "The Northwest Ridge has 2 snipers, not 1. They've been alternating fire to keep the pattern irregular. The East building has a crew-served weapon. Sounds like a PKM 7.62 mm, and they are running it on a tripod because the cadence is too steady for a handheld. The South Tree line has the bulk of the infantry. There's also a mortar crew somewhere north, approximately 680 meters. They haven't fired yet because they are waiting for us to attempt a breakout." Donovan stayed at her for 3 full seconds. "How do you know that?" "Because that's what I would do," she said. He had no answer for that. He looked at the case between her knees. "What's in the pack, Hart?" She looked at him then, for the first time. Her eyes were dark and completely steady, the way water is steady before it moves. "The only thing that might make a difference today," she said. She unlatched the case. If you have ever watched someone do something and understood in the same moment that everything you thought you knew about them was simply the surface of something deeper, if you have ever experienced that particular kind of revelation, drop a comment below and tell us about it. Because what Sergeant Donovan witnessed in the next 4 to 5 seconds was exactly that kind of moment. The Barrett M17 was a custom-modified .50 caliber antimaterial rifle, its designation visible only to those who knew what to look for in the machined serial markings on the receiver. It was not standard issue. It was not remotely standard issue. The weapon had been built to specification by a private armor working under a contract classification that most of the Army had never heard of, and its modifications included a helical suppressor housing machine from a titanium steel alloy that reduced its acoustic signature to approximately 1/4 of an unsuppressed equivalent, a custom adjustable cheek rest set to 23 specific millimeter positions from a previous user's calibration, and a Schmidt & Bender 5-25x56 PM2 LP. Scope with a zero locked at 800 meters and holdover marks calibrated out to 1,900 meters. The rifle was 145.4 centimeters long. It weighed 14.2 kilograms assembled. When Leah Hart lifted it from the padded interior of the case, she handled it the way a person handles something they have carried 10,000 times. It was a zero that told Donovan everything he needed to know without a single additional word. A logistics clerk did not zero a Barrett M17 to 800 meters. A logistics clerk did not carry a Barrett M17. A logistics clerk did not sit at a crack in a stone wall cataloging enemy firing positions and mortar placement by acoustic analysis alone. The woman beside him was not a logistics clerk. She pulled 4 cylindrical suppressors from padded slots in the case's lower section, a cleaning rod she did not need, and 11 preloaded Pelican-sealed 5-round magazines of match-grade .50 BMG ammunition with 661-grain Hornady AMAX projectiles, which she stacked in a careful sequence along the base of the wall with the same methodical precision she presumably brought to fuel requisition spreadsheets. 55 rounds total. She checked the action once, ran her thumb along the bolt face, and chambered a round in a movement so fluid and economical it belonged to someone who had been doing it since before it was a conscious thought. Donovan grabbed her arm. "Hart, I need to know what I'm looking at before you do anything." She did not pull away. She simply said, "I'm going to need 14 seconds of cover fire on the East building at the count of 3. Can your machine gun hold trigger for 14 seconds?" Donovan looked at the woman he had categorized as a supply clerk for 41 days. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the 11 lined-up magazines. He thought about 27 people and a dying afternoon and a mortar crew that was being very patient and a radio that no longer existed. "Yes," he said. "He can." She nodded once and moved to a different section of wall. Donovan slid back to V and Waver. "On my count," he said. 14 seconds. East building. Everything you have. Villanueva looked at him. Then he looked down the wall to where Leah Hart was repositioning herself. Something passed across his face. Donovan recognized it because he was feeling it himself. It was not quite hope and it was not quite confusion. It was the specific feeling of a situation rearranging itself without your permission. The count went to 3. Villanueva opened up with the M249 and the east building dissolved into fragments of dust and plaster and ricocheting fragments. The sound was enormous and violent, and for 14 seconds it dominated everything. In those 14 seconds, nobody heard the Barrett fire. Suppressed. The M17's report was a compressed mechanical thud, like a heavy door closing in a concrete hallway. You could feel it more than hear it in the open air. But the effect of its first round was neither mechanical nor subtle. The PKM crew in the east building, 2 men and a gun, ceased to exist as a functional unit in the interval between one breath and the next. The first round struck the gunner at a measured 243 meters through the eastern window aperture at a terminal velocity sufficient to end the engagement instantaneously. The second round, fired 3.8 seconds later, removed the ammunition bearer from the equation. The third round, fired at 7.1 seconds, destroyed the PKM mount itself, the heavy projectile deforming the receiver housing beyond any function. 3 shots, 7.1 seconds. 1 crew-served weapon eliminated. Villanueva's 14 seconds of cover fire ended. The east building went quiet. Completely quiet. In a way that was different from being suppressed. Donovan pressed himself to the wall and looked at the gap in the stone through which he could see the back of Leah Hart's shoulder. She was already moving. Already reorienting. Already adjusting her elevation dial by precise number of clicks he could not count from his position, but which she performed without hesitation, her elbow anchored, her breathing slow and measured in a way that seemed almost offensive given the incoming fire still raking the north wall. She fired twice toward the northwest ridge. Then she waited 7 seconds. Then she fired once more. The sniper on the ridge's left position had been working from behind a natural stone outcropping at approximately 382 meters elevation, using a suppressed Dragunov variant and the patience of someone who had done this before. The second sniper had been 28 meters to his right, positioned in a shallow depression in the rock, invisible to the naked eye. Both positions had been invisible. Leah Hart was not using the naked eye. The first round struck the left position shooter at 382 meters through a gap in the outcropping he had believed was invisible from below. It was not invisible to a woman who had spent 7 minutes studying the ridge through 12 millimeters of stone crack with a calculation of someone working a problem she had solved before in some other valley, in some other life. The second round struck a different point on the same rock face. Not the second shooter, but his rifle. The heavy .50 BMG projectile impacted the Dragunov's receiver through the narrow gap in the depression and destroyed the weapon. The third round, when the second shooter raised his head to understand what had happened to his partner, was the only shot Leah Hart fired that day without full certainty of outcome. She had a 0.4-second window. She used it. 2 snipers. 3 rounds. The northwest ridge went quiet. The platoon had been in that stone settlement for 22 minutes. In the last 90 seconds, they had lost 1 crew-served weapon and 2 counterfire specialists to a woman nobody had been watching. If this story is already doing something to you, if you are already leaning closer to whatever screen you are watching this on, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us your favorite part so far, because this story has only just started moving. Sergeant Donovan crawled to Leah Hart's position. He was not a man who crawled easily, in the physical sense or in any other sense. He got there. She was working the bolt. Spent brass on the ground beside her right knee, oriented in a neat half-arc that suggested each had fallen exactly where she expected. She was counting something in her head. He could see it in the slight movement of her lips, doing wind calculations, probably, or adjusting for the heat shimmer rising from the valley floor, which had been building since 9 o'clock, and by this point at just after 10:30 was creating visible distortion at distances beyond 400 meters. The mortar crew, Donovan said. Can you reach 680 meters? Yes. You said they are north. We have no cover to the north. I know where the cover is, she said. He stared at her. "Hart. Sergeant." She turned her head and looked at him directly for only the second time since the engagement had started. "I need you to trust me for about 90 more seconds. Can you do that?" The question was not hostile. It was not challenging. It was exactly the tone of a professional asking another professional a reasonable operational question. The tone of someone who had given that exact instruction before and had not yet been wrong about the 90 seconds. Donovan thought about everything he had seen in the last 2 minutes. He looked at the brass on the ground. He looked at the magazines stacked along the wall with a numbered orientation system she had created and which he now realized was a priority sequencing system, not a storage arrangement. He looked at the scope on the Barrett and at the minute elevation adjustment she had made without referencing a card, without referencing anything except the interior of her own knowledge. 90 seconds, he said. She moved. Private Leah Hart moved through the courtyard of that ruined settlement in a way that nobody moved through a courtyard with active incoming fire. Not running, not crouching and sprinting, moving, low and fluid and using the specific geometry of the broken walls and collapsed roof sections as though she had studied the floor plan in advance, which was impossible because she had been riding in a carrier until 47 minutes ago. But she knew angles. She knew the principle of it, the simple, brutal geometry of dead ground and elevation angles, and how a mortar crew set up at 680 meters oriented their weapon and where they needed to stand to service it and where that placed them in relation to the specific ruin she was now navigating. She reached a gap in the north wall at the settlement's corner, pressed herself flat, looked, made one adjustment to her scope, 4 clicks up, 2 clicks left, the movements automatic and confirming some calculation she had already completed in her head. She anchored her elbow on a fallen stone, her cheek to the stock, her breathing dropping to the frequency of someone sleeping. She fired twice, then once more. Then she moved back through the courtyard to her original position before Donovan had fully processed what he had heard. The mortar crew, 3 men, 1 82mm mortar baseplate, 14 assembled rounds that would have ended this engagement in Alpha Platoon's last possible way, ceased to be a mortar crew. Donovan counted. He had told her 90 seconds. She had been gone for 64. The incoming fire from the south tree line was still active and heavy, but the pattern had changed. The rhythm had changed. The confidence had left it. Because whoever was commanding that infantry force in the tree line had just heard his northwest snipers go silent, his eastern Khrushchev position go silent, and his mortar crew go silent, and he was now working with a calculation problem for which he had not prepared. There was a weapon in those ruins he had not identified, a weapon of a type that should not be in that location, a weapon that was killing his specialists from behind cover he had assessed as offering no viable firing positions. Donovan watched Leah Hart return to her place at the wall crack. She set her rifle down, briefly, only briefly, and flexed her right hand 3 times, then 4, the way a person resets attention they have been holding. It was the only human thing she had done since she opened the case. He moved close enough that only she could hear him. "Who are you?" It was not a question in the usual sense. It was something else. It was a man acknowledging that the story he had written in his head about someone had been wrong from the first page. She picked the rifle back up. "The mortar crew had a radio," she said. "They got a call off before I reached them. Whoever's on the other end of that call is going to send something. We have maybe 14 minutes before the character of this engagement changes." Donovan absorbed that. Changes how? She looked at him, and in her eyes, for just a moment, he saw something beneath the calculation. Something that was not fear exactly, but was a specific weight of a person who knew what was coming because they had seen it before. "Significantly," she said, "tell us in the comments whether you saw this moment coming. Because we want to know what you were thinking right here, right now, at this part of the story. Drop your answer below." There was a name she carried that almost nobody alive knew. Reaper Hart. It had been assigned to her at the beginning of the Shadow Line program, a designation from the Classified Marksmanship Initiative that had operated under Joint Special Operations Command for 4 years beginning in 2018 before being officially discontinued, on paper, in 2022. The Shadow Line program had trained 11 operatives across 2 cohorts, selecting for candidates who demonstrated a specific and unusual combination of technical precision under extreme physical stress and an almost preternatural ability to process environmental variables, wind, light, temperature gradients, target movement patterns, in real time without computational assistance. Leah Hart had been the youngest candidate in the program's history. She had been 23 when she was selected from a pool of 847 qualified applicants who had been vetted without their knowledge. She had entered the program believing she was attending an advanced logistics certification course at Fort Carson, Colorado. The logistics cover was standard. The deception was considered necessary. And in the first 2 weeks of assessment, she had disassembled that deception with the same systematic efficiency she would later apply to enemy firing positions, simply by noticing 17 specific inconsistencies between what she had been told about the facility and what the facility actually was. Her instructor, the only person who had ever called her Reaper Hart with genuine affection rather than clinical designation, had been Major Hannah Chen. Hannah Chen had been 44 years old when she took Leah as her primary student in the program's second cohort. She had come from a background in competitive long-range shooting where she had set 3 national records before her military career, and she had brought to the Shadowline program a philosophy about precision marksmanship that went beyond the technical into something almost philosophical. Hannah believed that the sniper's most important attribute was not patience, which was a commonly given answer, and not accuracy, which was the obviously given answer. Hannah believed it was weight. The weight of understanding exactly what each trigger pull meant. Not in the operational sense, in the human sense. In the sense that a person who truly understood the weight of what they were doing would calculate everything, every variable, every potential consequence, every possible degree of error, with a depth of commitment that patience and accuracy alone could not achieve. She had told Leah this on the 3rd day of training, sitting in a room at Fort Carson with rain against the windows and coffee going cold on the table between them. Every bullet changes the world, Hannah had said. Small ways, large ways, but never in no way at all. You carry that weight or it carries you. There's no third option. Leah had carried it. For 3 years in the program, then for 3 years in the exile she had put herself in after. The exile had started in a valley not unlike this one. In a country not unlike this one, on a morning when everything had been operating within acceptable parameters and then, in the space of 3 seconds, had not. Hannah had been in a forward position during an extraction operation. There had been a protocol delay, a confirmation requirement built into the operational rules of engagement that required a secondary authorization before certain categories of high-value targets could be engaged. The delay was 3 seconds. Standard procedure. Leah had seen the threat. She had calculated it. She had known, with the certainty of someone who had practiced this 10,000 times, exactly what was happening and exactly what 3 seconds would cost. She had waited for authorization. She had been 3 seconds too slow. Hannah Chen had been dead before the echo of the shot that killed her reached Leah's position. The official report had cleared Leah of any wrongdoing. Protocol compliance. Procedural correctness. Not liable. The language of bureaucratic exoneration that somehow managed to be worse than blame, because blame at least acknowledged that something real had happened. Exoneration felt like being told the world in which Hannah died did not officially exist. Leah had requested a transfer to logistics 6 weeks after the official report was filed. She had asked to go somewhere quiet. Somewhere numbers were the dominant reality and the variables were inventory levels rather than wind speed and target proximity. Somewhere she could exist without carrying the weight, because she had decided, in the long, airless nights of that first month, that the weight was something she was no longer capable of carrying without breaking. She had been wrong about that, about being incapable of carrying it. She knew that now, here, in these ruins, with brass on the ground and the smell of burnt propellant on her hands and the specific silence of position she had neutralized. But she had not known it in time to save Hannah. And that was the thing that had not changed. Maybe you know what it feels like to carry something you cannot put down and cannot explain to the people around you. Maybe you have seen someone else carry that weight without knowing its name. If this part of the story is speaking to something you recognize, drop a comment. Tell us what you are thinking. Because the heaviest things are almost never visible from the outside. The 14 minutes she had estimated shortened to 11. She knew it before she heard the engines, because the quality of the infantry fire from the south tree line changed at the 10-minute mark. The volume decreased, not because fighters were leaving, because they were redistributing, making room, creating a lane through which something larger could approach. She heard the first engine at 10:47 by her count from the moment the mortar crew had gone silent. Then the second, then a third. The enemy had sent 3 technical vehicles, modified pickup trucks with heavy machine guns mounted in the bed, 2 of them with DSK 12.7mm guns, and 1 with what her ear told her was a ZPU 14.5, plus what the engine acoustics suggested was a 4th vehicle of significantly heavier construction. The infantry force in the tree line was not retreating. They were consolidating, moving to cut off the last viable exit route from the settlement, the dry creek bed to the southwest that Donovan had been quietly considering as a breakout corridor. She ran the numbers without emotion, the way she had been taught. 3 technicals with crew-served weapons at ranges between 200 and 400 meters. 1 heavier vehicle whose type she had not yet confirmed. Residual infantry, estimated between 40 and 55 fighters still functional. 1 sniper. She was fairly certain there was still 1 counter-sniper element she had not yet located, because the northwest ridge had been too quiet for too long after she eliminated the original pair, and someone with tactical sense would have repositioned a reserve element to a new location after losing the first 2. Her count? 8 magazines remaining. 40 rounds. Against a reinforced force that had been summoned specifically because something in those ruins was performing outside of any reasonable expectation. They were bringing an annihilation force. Not to suppress Alpha Platoon. To end it. Donovan had reached the same conclusion without the benefit of acoustic vehicle identification. She could tell by the way he moved when he came back to her position, with the specific controlled urgency of a commander who has accepted a bad situation and is now only calculating how bad he can afford to let it get. "We need to move," he said. "The creek bed is already compromised," she said. "The vehicle moving to our south is positioning to cut it off. You have approximately 4 minutes before that lane closes." He looked at her. 4 minutes isn't enough to move 27 people through that creek bed. "No," she said. "It isn't." Silence between them for 2 seconds. The kind of silence that contains a decision someone doesn't want to make. "But 8 is," she said. Donovan understood her immediately. He was the kind of man who understood things immediately when he needed to. "No," he said. "Sergeant. Absolutely not. Someone has to draw their attention north," she said. Her voice was still level, still quiet. Still the voice of someone presenting a calculation rather than an argument. "If they are looking north, they are not watching the creek bed. If I'm north, giving them a reason to look, you can move the entire platoon through that corridor in 8 minutes. Possibly 7. Donovan stared at her. Drawing their attention means getting on top of something. There's only one thing north that's high enough to draw fire from every direction. He was looking at the observation tower. It stood at the settlement's northern edge, a pre-existing structure built from stone and timber that had been there since before any of them had arrived. It was approximately 9 meters tall. Its upper platform offered unobstructed sight lines in every direction at the cost of being completely exposed in every direction. Its base had been compromised by whatever blast or event had partially collapsed its eastern support wall sometime before this morning. The tower was standing. But it was standing the way a thing stands when it is considering its options. "There are 32 rounds left in that case," Leah Hart said. "I can keep a force of that size occupied for between 6 and 8 minutes from that elevation. Enough time for you to clear the creek bed with everyone. You won't survive 6 minutes on top of that tower." She looked at him, and in her face, he saw something that had not been there before. Something that was not peace exactly, but was a decision made from a place deeper than fear. "I survived the last 3 years," she said. 6 minutes is short. Drop a comment right now and tell us, if you were Sergeant Donovan in this moment, what would you do? Because this was the decision point. This was the exact second when the weight of everything converged. And what he decided next changed everything that followed. He grabbed her arm, not to stop her, but because there was something he needed her to understand before she moved. 27 people, he said. I will personally account for every one of them. You hear me? Every single one." She looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. Something shifted in her expression, fractional, almost invisible, but present. 27, she said, quietly, like a number she was adding to a count she had been keeping for a long time. She picked up her rifle. She picked up the remaining magazines. She left the empty case on the ground. She walked north. Specialist Finn Calloway, 22 years old from Portland, Oregon, watched her go and later said that what he remembered most was not the rifle or the tower or the sounds that followed. What he remembered was the way she walked. Straight, unhurried, as if the distance between where she was and where she was going was exactly the distance she had always meant to travel. Private Hector Villanueva watched her climb the first section of the tower's exterior ladder and said nothing, but his expression, by multiple accounts from other soldiers, was the expression of someone witnessing something they did not yet have a word for. Tanya Osei, her hand still wrapped in a field bandage from her own minor wound received in the first exchange, watched for exactly 4 seconds before turning to Donovan and saying, simply and without drama, "We need to move." Donovan gave the order. 27 soldiers began moving toward the creek bed in a coordinated column, low and fast, using every piece of cover the settlement's western wall could provide. Above them, Private First Class Leah Hart, Reaper Hart, of the Shadow Line program's second cohort, a woman who had spent 3 years in self-imposed exile carrying a weight that had no official name, climbed the final rungs of a compromised stone observation tower in a war zone with 32 rounds of .50 caliber match-grade ammunition and an account with a world she was determined to settle. She reached the top. She settled the bearer to cross the platform's parapet, anchoring her bipod on a stone surface that trembled slightly beneath her. The tower was already moving, already deciding, the eastern wall's fractures propagating through the stone with the patient finality of a thing that had been waiting for exactly this much additional weight. She looked through the scope. She found the first technical vehicle at 347 meters. She found the second at 289 meters. She found the infantry spread across the field between the tree line and the settlement's north face, moving, reorganizing, not yet understanding what they were looking at in the tower, not yet repositioning to engage it, because the tower had been empty for the entirety of this engagement, and the human mind is always slightly behind the reality it finds itself in. She had approximately 4 seconds before someone in that force identified her silhouette against the morning sky. She used the first second to breathe. She used the second to confirm her windage, 9 kilometers per hour from the northwest, adjusting her hold 0.4 mils right. She used the third second to decide which target eliminated the most capability per round. She used the fourth second to fire. The battle for Ember Ridge entered its final phase. If you are still watching, if you have been here from the first word and you cannot look away, we see you, and we want you to stay with us. Because what happens next, what happens in those next 7 minutes on top of that tower, and what happens after, that is the part of this story that no one who was there ever forgot. Drop a comment below and tell us you are still here, because part 2 of this story is coming, and it will not leave you the same way it found you. The Barrett fired, and fired, and fired. She worked through the first technical at 347 meters in 2 rounds, one for the gunner, one that destroyed the Dishike mounting brace and rendered the weapon non-functional. She transitioned to the second technical, 289 meters, and took 3 rounds to manage that engagement because the vehicle was moving, its driver recognizing the threat late, but not too late to begin evasive action. She adjusted. She fired. She adjusted again. On the 3rd round, the vehicle stopped in a way that vehicles stop when the engine block has been penetrated by a projectile capable of stopping it. The enemy infantry was responding now, firing upward at the tower. The stone around her sparked and fractured as rounds impacted the parapet. She felt a fragment open a cut above her right ear, sharp and brief and dismissed. She found the 3rd technical at 203 meters, closer than she would have preferred, and engaged it with 1 round that the vehicle commander apparently had not anticipated coming from that angle. 15 rounds fired. She searched for the counter-sniper she had suspected was still active. She found the position in a drainage ditch at the field's northeastern edge, 418 meters, because the shooter had just given himself away by firing. Good discipline, firing only when he had a confirmed target, which was her. And the muzzle flash from a suppressed weapon is invisible, but the impulse of disturbed dust around the muzzle is not, if you know what to look for and you are looking at the right place at the right time. She had been looking at the right place. 2 rounds. The counter-sniper ceased to be a problem. The tower shuddered, not from incoming fire, from within. The eastern wall's fractures were accelerating, stress traveling through the stone in the specific way that precedes a decision point in structural integrity. She felt it through the platform beneath her, through the bipod's contact with the parapet, through the soles of her boots. A vibration that was not from outside. 17 rounds fired. 15 remaining. Donovan's platoon had been moving for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She needed 4 more minutes at minimum. She worked the numbers and found them acceptable and kept firing. The command element for the enemy force. She identified him by his position, his radio handset, and the specific urgency of how every other person near him was oriented relative to him, was at 511 meters. Beyond the optimal range she would have chosen. Not beyond the range of the M17. She adjusted her elevation. 7 clicks up, 3 right for the crosswind component at that distance, and placed the reticle on him with the specific certainty of someone who has computed 511 meters so many times in training that the number has its own physical feeling in her hands. She exhaled. She fired. The command element's radio handset went silent. And in the sudden, confused reorganization that follows when a force loses its command voice in the middle of an engagement, Sergeant Marcus Donovan led 27 soldiers through the last 40 meters of the creek bed corridor and out the other side. The tower made its final decision at 5 minutes and 41 seconds from when she had climbed to the top. The eastern wall let go with a sound she would later describe. In a medical facility, with both a concussion and 3 fractured ribs and a shoulder dislocated by the impact, as the sound of a decision that had been made a long time ago finally being delivered. The platform dropped on one side, tilting at a 30-degree angle toward the collapsing face, and she went with it, because there was no other direction available, and landed in the rubble of what had been the tower's lower eastern interior, with approximately 4 meters of stone and timber descending on top of her in the next 2 seconds. She held onto the rifle. She did not know why, except that Hannah had once said something about weapons being extensions of intent, and that abandoning an intent was harder than abandoning an object, and that the two were not as separate as people thought. The rubble settled. The firing continued for another 6 minutes outside, directed at the ruins of the tower, directed at a silhouette that no longer existed in that location. Then it stopped. Then there were engines, growing distant. Then there was quiet of the specific kind that follows the end of a thing. She was in the dark. She was in the dark, and she was breathing, and she could hear, from somewhere outside the rubble, the sound of someone calling her name. She recognized the voice. It was Donovan, which meant the creek bed had worked, which meant the 27 had made it out. She counted. 1, 2, 3. She counted the way Hannah had taught her to count in the moments after an engagement when the adrenaline wanted to substitute for thought. 1, 2, 3. Let the calculation catch up. 27, she thought. 27. She had been 3 seconds too slow once. She had not been too slow today. Hot. Donovan's voice, closer now. She could hear others behind him, the sound of movement through rubble, careful and urgent. Hot. Call out. She opened her mouth. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. Here, she said. I'm here. She was under 4 meters of stone and timber in the ruins of a collapsed observation tower on a ridge that nobody had been meant to survive. She was badly injured and she was in the dark and her rifle was still in her hand. She was here. That is part 1. 27 people walked out of Ember Ridge because of what happened on top of that tower. But the full weight of what Leah Hart carried into that rubble, and what she found when she finally came out the other side, that story does not end in the dark beneath the stones. Part 2 is coming, and it will show you what happens when someone who spent 3 years running from the heaviest thing they ever carried finally stops running, and what they choose to do with their hands once they are empty of everything except purpose. If this story has meant something to you so far, If something in Leah Hart's silence or Donovan's 27 or Hannah's lesson about weight has landed somewhere real for you, drop a comment right now. Tell us what you are carrying. Tell us what you are watching this on, where you are, who you are. Your story belongs in this conversation too. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who has been 3 seconds too slow at something and has not forgiven themselves for it yet, share this with them. Because the next part of this story was written for exactly that person. We will see you in part 2. They found her at 11:34 in the morning. Sergeant First Class Marcus Donovan had led the platoon back through the creek bed corridor at a pace that left no room for argument, moving 27 people through 340 meters of dry waterway with the controlled urgency of a man who had made a promise and understood exactly what that promise cost. When they reached the far side, he did not stop to breathe. He turned around. He began moving back toward the smoke. 3 soldiers followed him without being ordered to. Specialist Finn Calloway, Private Hector Villanueva, Private Second Class Tanya Osei, her field bandaged dark with dried blood and her expression permitting no discussion on the subject of whether she was staying or going. None of them spoke about why they were going back. The reason was self-evident and did not require language. The tower had come down on the settlement's northern edge in a cascade of stone and splintered timber that had reduced a 9-meter structure to a rubble field approximately 3 meters high at its center. The enemy had disengaged. The technical vehicles were gone. The infantry force from the tree line had pulled back into terrain that offered them cover and distance, which told Donovan that the force had lost its command authority and the second-tier leadership had made a conservative decision. A retreating force was still a dangerous force, but it was a force pointed in a specific direction, and that direction was not here. The rubble field was quiet. Dusty white stone fragments and fractured timber and a silence that pressed against the ears. Donovan cupped his hands around his mouth. Hot. The word fell into the rubble and found nothing for 4 seconds. Then, hey, I'm here. The voice came from beneath approximately 2 meters of compacted stone on the tower's eastern quadrant. Small, steady, unmistakably hairs. They dug with their hands. There was no other equipment available. No hydraulic lifts. No excavation tools. Nothing except the hands of 4 soldiers in a ruined settlement on a ridge in a valley that would not appear in any news report and would take 3 days to reach by any vehicle larger than a motorcycle on the roads available. They dug with their hands, and they did not stop, and they did not speak except to coordinate the movement of specific stones that required more than one person's grip. Donovan's knuckles were bleeding within the first 4 minutes. Villanueva split the pad of his right palm on a fractured timber edge and kept pulling. Osei found a rhythm with Calloway, alternating the removal of smaller debris to clear weight from above the area where the voice had come from, systematic and efficient, like 2 people who had decided the situation had an acceptable outcome and were simply working toward it. At the 17-minute mark, Calloway's hand found another hand in the dark between 2 large stones. It was holding a rifle. He pulled. The rubble shifted. More hands reached in. Donovan braced himself against a tilting slab and pushed it clear. And Private First Class Leah Hart came out of the wreckage of the observation tower into the dust and the white morning light, bleeding from 3 separate locations on her head and upper body, her left arm hanging at an angle that was wrong, her right hand still closed around the grip of the Barrett M17. Her face coated in white stone dust so complete it looked like a mask, and her eyes, open, oriented, focused, doing the same thing they had been doing since the moment she unpacked that rifle from its case. Calculating. 27, she said, before Donovan had said anything at all. He understood the question. 27, he confirmed. Something happened in her face then. Not a collapse, not a breakdown, nothing that could be called dramatic in the obvious sense, but the specific quality of tension that had been present in her expression since the moment this morning's engagement began. The held breath quality, the unresolved account, shifted. Slightly. By approximately as much as the weight of 3 years can shift when a single number confirms that the ledger has been paid. She looked down at the rifle in her hand. Then she set it down carefully on the cleanest piece of stone she could reach. Her left arm was broken in 2 places. 3 ribs were fractured on her right side. She had a concussion serious enough to qualify as a traumatic brain injury by the clinical standards that would be applied when she reached a medical facility. She had a fragment wound above her right ear that had been bleeding for close to 40 minutes. Donovan visited each day. He brought coffee on day 2, which was not especially good coffee but was hot, and on day 4 he brought a report he had spent 3 days writing that documented every engagement action during the Ember Ridge incident with the precision of a man who understood that precision was the only protection available to a person whose actions would be reviewed by people who had not been there. He had listed every shot, every confirmed elimination, every position neutralized, every time reference. He had cross-referenced the debrief statements of all 27 surviving soldiers, who without any coordination among themselves had produced accounts that were consistent to a degree that could not be manufactured, because truth has a specific texture that is different from constructed narrative and trained investigators know the difference. His report was 11 pages and 47 lines, and it was going to matter. On day 8, Colonel Diane Marsh arrived at FOB Kajun. Colonel Marsh was 51 years old and had been in Army intelligence for 23 years and had the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have sat in rooms where things are decided and have learned not to let the weight of those rooms change their posture. She was the officer assigned to review the Ember Ridge incident, but she was also, and Leah understood this within the first 90 seconds of their meeting, the officer assigned to determine what to do about the shadow line classification that was now attached to a logistics clerk who had just very publicly demonstrated capabilities that logistics clerks did not possess. They met in a room with 2 chairs and a table and a window that faced a concrete wall. Colonel Marsh placed Donovan's 11-page report on the table and placed beside it a separate folder whose classification markings Leah recognized without needing to see the specific designation. Then she placed her hands flat on the table and looked at Leah with the expression of someone who has decided to have an honest conversation. "Private First Class Hart," she said. "I've read everything available. I want you to help me understand one thing." She paused. The self-transfer to logistics. The 41 days as a clerk. The case that went with you. Another pause. Shorter. "You knew, coming into that theater, that the probability of contact was above nominal. Every soldier in this sector knows that, which means you chose a position in the support chain, away from direct contact, carrying a weapon specifically designed for direct engagement." She looked at Leah directly. "That's not someone who was done with this work. That's someone who was trying to be done with it." Leah looked at the classified folder on the table, at the report beside it, at her own hands, the left one still wrapped in a brace from the surgery, at the window with the concrete wall behind it that did not tell her anything about what direction they were facing. "There's a difference," she said, "between not being able to put something down and being ready to pick it up." Marsh was quiet for a moment. What changed that morning? And here was the thing that Leah Hart had been calculating since she came out of the rubble. Since the moment Donovan had said 27, since the night she had slept in the medical facility with the generators running and Hannah's old lesson about weight settling into her the way lessons only settle when you have finally lived the context they were designed for. "I stopped waiting for authorization," she said. "Not for the mission. Not for permission to engage. For herself. She had been waiting, for 3 years, for something external to tell her that the 3 seconds were accounted for, that the balance was settled, that the official report's language of exoneration had made its way into the internal record and been accepted. But authorization for that was never going to come from outside. The only person who could authorize her return was the person who had been holding herself under protocols that no longer served the mission. Colonel Marsh looked at her for a long time. Then she opened the classified folder. She turned 3 pages. She stopped at a specific page and turned it so Leah could read it. It was a memorandum, dated 4 months ago, signed by Lieutenant General Victor Aldis, Joint Special Operations Command. It was addressed to the Shadow Line Program suspended personnel file, all 11 of them, and it was not exoneration, which was too small a word, and it was not reinstatement, which missed the point entirely. It was a formal recognition that the protocol delay mechanism that had been active at the time of Major Hannah Chen's death had been reviewed, assessed, and found to have been a systemic failure in operational protocol design rather than an individual failure in execution. The 3-second authorization requirement had been removed from field engagement protocols across all Shadow Line successor programs, effective immediately. The review board's recommendation, included as an addendum, noted specifically that the individual operator present at the time of Major Chen's death had performed within all required parameters and bore no operational responsibility for the outcome. The individual operator was not named. The classification held that in place. But Leah knew who the individual operator was. She read the document twice. Then she set it down on the table with the same careful placement she gave to everything. The rifle, the spent brass, the magazines lined along the base of the wall. She put it down the way a person sets down something they have been carrying for a long time and are only now recognizing the weight of, because you don't feel the full weight of a thing until you put it down and your arms understand what absence feels like. Her eyes did not change. Not visibly. Not in any way that could be documented in a report. But something in the room changed. Colonel Marsh felt it, and she was not a woman who made note of things that could not be documented. But she made note of this. If you have ever read something, a letter, a report, a single sentence, that ended a grief you had been carrying so long you thought it was permanent, we want you to drop a comment below and tell us about it. Because Leah Hart read 4 pages of classified military language and felt something release that had been locked for 3 years. And sometimes the most important things in a person's life look, from the outside, like paperwork. Drop your comment. Tell us if you understand what that feels like. Colonel Marsh asked 3 more questions. They took 11 minutes. Then she closed the folder, stood, and extended her hand. Leah shook it, left hand, because the right brace made that the practical choice, and because the practical choice was always the one she made. The Army, Colonel Marsh said, has a decision to make about your status and your future assignment. That decision will involve people above my pay grade and will take the time it takes. But I want you to know, before anyone else makes any formal statements, that what happened on that ridge, and what happened in the 3 years before it, has been seen clearly. All of it. She picked up her folder. Major Chen trained well. She left. Leah sat in the room with the concrete wall and the 2 chairs and the classified folder that Colonel Marsh had, perhaps intentionally, left on the table. Her left shoulder had been dislocated by the impact of the fall and then re-dislocated by her movement within the rubble, which Donovan could tell from the angle, but which she had apparently neither stopped to address nor mentioned. She looked at the people around her with an expression that was not quite gratitude, too practical for that, and not quite relief, too controlled for that. It was something more like recognition, the expression of someone who has come through a door they were not certain would be there. "We need to move before they reorganize," she said. Tanya Osei looked at her for 1 full second. Then she put her good arm around Leah's right side and said, "We're moving. You're moving with us." They moved. If you are watching this and you have ever been pulled out of something by people who came back for you, not because they were ordered to, but because that was simply what they were going to do, drop a comment below. Because this part of the story belongs to you as much as it belongs to her. The evacuation took 9 hours. There was no air support until hour 6, when a medical helicopter designated Dustov 7 reached their position coordinates after Donovan's team had constructed an improvised ground-to-air signal using vehicle mirrors and a strip of orange marker panel salvage from a destroyed carrier. The helicopter's flight medic, Specialist Carmen Adeyemi, assessed Leah's injuries in under 4 minutes and began field stabilization with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned that the first 4 minutes mattered more than the next 4 hours. She stabilized the broken arm with a rigid splint. She administered a pain management protocol that Leah refused twice before accepting on the 3rd offer, not because she was trying to be strong, Adeyemi would say this later, specifically, but because she needed to stay oriented. She needed to stay in the calculation. The helicopter reached forward operating base Kajin at 2047. The surgical team there took over from Adeyemi without ceremony and with complete professionalism. Leah Hart was in surgery for 2 hours and 17 minutes. The left arm required internal fixation with 2 titanium plates and 6 screws. The shoulder was reduced under general anesthetic. The ribs were managed conservatively with binding and pain control. The concussion would require monitoring and rest and a period of cognitive evaluation before any return-to-duty assessment could be completed. She was conscious again at 23:14. The first person she saw was Donovan, who was sitting in a chair beside her bed with his arms folded across his chest and the expression of a man who had several questions and had been organizing them in order of priority for approximately 3 hours. He asked none of them that night. He simply said, "All 27 checked in. Villanueva has 11 stitches in his palm. Jose's arm is fine. Webb lost the use of 2 fingers in his right hand, but the surgeons think there's a chance, with time." He paused. "Devin Rashid's family is being notified today." She absorbed that. Corporal Devin Rashid, 24, from Birmingham, Alabama. She had not known him well. She had known his name, because she had known everyone's name, quietly, in the way she knew everything, without announcing it. She closed her eyes for a moment. 1. An account that began at 0 and would always include Rashid and always include Hannah and would never, she had decided somewhere in the dark beneath the rubble, reach a number that unmade their deaths. But also would never stop being a count, because a count meant they were real and had mattered, and that was the only form of permanence available. "Thank you," she said, to Donovan, "for the number, for coming back." He nodded once. He looked at the Barrett M17, which was leaning against the wall in the corner of the room, because Adeyemi had understood without being told that the rifle was not to be separated from its owner, and Donovan had confirmed that understanding with a single nod when they had loaded onto the helicopter. "When you're ready," he said, "I have some questions." "I know," she said. "They can wait." "I know that, too," she said. And then, after a pause that lasted long enough for the room's fluorescent light to flicker once, shadow line. "Second cohort. Designation Reaper Heart. Assigned March 2019. Program suspended October 2022. Current status: self-transferred to logistics. Fort Carson record shows administrative reassignment. Classification remains active." Donovan said nothing. "You were going to find it anyway," she said. "You're the kind of man who finds things." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the room, the sounds of the forward operating base at night, generators, distant vehicle movement, the ambient machinery of a military installation that never fully slept. Finally, he said, "How many of those 41 days in logistics were real?" She almost smiled. "All of them," she said. "I'm very good at inventory management." He looked at her for a long moment. 41 days, he said. "And you carried that case the entire time?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent light steadied. "Because Hannah told me once that a tool you don't carry can't be used when you need it." She meant it about more than rifles. She paused. "I thought I was done. I thought I had put it down permanently. But I brought the case because I couldn't actually put it down, which is something I understood about the case and had not yet understood about myself." Donovan did not answer that. There was nothing to answer. He stood up and put on his cover and moved toward the door, and at the doorway he stopped and looked back at her once. "Reaper Heart," he said, not as a call sign, as a recognition. She met his eyes. "Donovan." He nodded and left. She lay in the quiet and listened to the generators and held the weight of the day the way Hannah had taught her to hold the weight of everything, fully, without flinching, as something that belonged to her rather than something that was happening to her. 27. 1. 27. It was not a balance sheet. Arithmetic did not apply to people. But 27 was a real number, and it was a true number, and in her experience, real true numbers were the only currency that bought anything permanent. She slept. Tell us in the comments, did you expect her to tell him everything that night? Because that moment, that choice she made, to give Donovan the answer before he had to chase it, says everything about who she was. Drop your thoughts below. We want to hear from you. The investigation began 8 days later, which was how long it took the necessary personnel to be assembled and for the classification protocols around the Shadow Line program to be addressed by the 2 people in the Army's chain of command who possessed the authority to address them. Leah spent those 8 days in the medical facility at FOB Kajin, which was not a comfortable environment for rest, but which she used for rest anyway, because her body had made it clear that it was not accepting alternative proposals. She sat with it for a long time, not reading it again, just sitting with it. The way you sit with something that has been resolved and requires no further calculation. The way you sit in a room after a long conversation when the conversation has said what it needed to say and the silence after it is not empty but full. She thought about Hannah. Not the day in the valley, not the 3 seconds, not the thing she had thought about every day for 3 years. She thought about the room at Fort Carson with the rain against the windows and the coffee going cold and the thing Hannah had said about weight. Every bullet changes the world. Small ways, large ways, but never in no way at all. You carry that weight or it carries you. She had been carried by it for 3 years, and she had brought it here, to this ridge, in a polymer case with reinforced aluminum corners, and she had used it to bring 27 people home. She thought that was probably what Hannah had meant, in the end. Not that the weight was survivable, not that it got lighter, but that it was purposeful, that there was a use for what you carried, if you could hold it long enough and steady enough and true enough to find the angle. She was ready to hold it now. Donovan found her there 20 minutes later and said, "You're going to be transferred." "I know," she said. "The assignment is pending a full recovery evaluation and a classification review that's going to take however long it takes," she said. He looked at her. He had a daughter in Savannah whose school drawings he kept in his left chest pocket, and he was the kind of man who recognized when a person had arrived somewhere true. He had been watching Leah Hart arrive there, incrementally, since she climbed down from the rubble with a broken arm and a rifle and a number. He recognized it completely now. "Hannah Chen," he said. He had found the name in the documents he had requested through his own channels, because he was the kind of man who found things. She would have been proud. Leah looked at him for a long moment. "She already was," she said. "I just needed to catch up." Recovery took 4 months and 19 days. Not because the physical injuries required that long. The arm was fully weight-bearing at 11 weeks. The ribs resolved at 8. The concussion symptoms cleared the clinical threshold at 10. But because the Army's classification review process involving a suspended Special Operations Program and a former operative whose cover identity had been operationally compromised required committees and memoranda and a chain of approvals that moved at the pace of institutions that have learned to be thorough because the alternative is wise. Leah spent that time at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, in a building that smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint and the particular institutional quietness of a place where serious people came to be serious about recovery. She did the physical therapy. She did the cognitive assessments. She ran, first on a treadmill at 4.7 kilometers per hour, then on the facility's outdoor track at 7.2, then at 9.4, then at whatever pace she wanted, which was fast. She read. She ate the cafeteria food and found it acceptable and said so, which the staff appreciated because most patients did not find it acceptable or say so either way. She sat on the outdoor bench on the facility's east side in the late afternoons when the autumn light came through the maple trees at an angle that turned everything briefly amber, and she wrote in a small notebook with a mechanical pencil, numbers, mostly, and occasionally sentences that were not quite notes and not quite letters to a person who was no longer living to receive them. She did not bring the rifle to Walter Reed. She knew where it was. That was sufficient. On the final day of her recovery evaluation, a Thursday in November with the temperature at 43 degrees Fahrenheit and a wind from the northwest at 14 kilometers per hour, she sat across from Major Gerald Hicks, the facility's senior return-to-duty physician, and answered his final assessment questions. Physical mobility, full range restored. Cognitive function, within normal parameters and then some, he noted, in a way that suggested his assessment form had not been designed to account for the upper end. Psychological readiness. This one he asked carefully, in the manner of someone who understood that the question was both clinical and personal and that the two did not always align. She answered him the way she had answered Colonel Marsh 8 weeks earlier. Directly and completely and without the specific hollowness that had been present in her voice and her answers for 3 years and which Major Hicks, who had conducted 214 return-to-duty evaluations, recognized by its absence. "Ready," she said. He signed the form. The reassignment orders arrived 4 days later. She read them twice. She set them down carefully on the table in her room. Then she sat with them the way she had sat with a classified folder on the table in the room with a concrete wall. Not reading, not calculating, just holding the weight of what had been decided and feeling it settle into the right shape. The orders read, Fort Harrison, Indiana. Advanced Marksmanship Training Facility. Instructor, Primary Sniper Qualification Course. Effective January 7th. She was going to teach. Drop a comment right now and tell us, when you read that she was going to teach, what did you feel? Because this was the moment. This was the closing of the circle. And we want to know if you felt it the way we felt writing it. Tell us in the comments. Fort Harrison in January was gray and cold and very flat, which is its own kind of honesty. The Advanced Marksmanship Training Facility occupied a low set of buildings on the installation's southeastern quadrant, adjacent to a firing range complex that stretched across 1,200 meters of cleared ground with target systems at 300, 600, 800, 1,000, and 1,200-meter intervals. The trees at the range far end were bare of leaves and looked like notation marks against the pale sky, thin vertical lines at intervals that told a practiced eye something about how the wind moved through the corridor. Leah arrived on January 5th, 2 days early. She requested access to the range on January 6th, which was a Sunday, and Master Sergeant Dale Kellerman, the facility's range master, looked at the authorization paperwork she presented and looked at her and looked at the Barrett M17 in its polymer case and made the specific kind of assessment that experienced non-commissioned officers make when they encounter something that does not fit their existing framework. Kellerman was 53 years old and had been running ranges for 19 years. He had a face like topographic terrain and a voice that sounded like gravel being sorted. He believed, as a professional in philosophical matter, that marksmanship was learned through repetition rather than revealed through occasion. He was not hostile to Leah Hart's presence at Fort Harrison. He was skeptical of it, which was different. Skepticism, in his experience, was simply readiness to be shown evidence. He was ready to be shown evidence. He approved the range access on January 6th at 9 o'clock in a temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit with a crosswind component of 17 kilometers per hour from the west-northwest and a slight atmospheric pressure change from an incoming weather system that was creating a measurable density-altitude shift of approximately 200 feet above standard. Conditions that most instructors would have used as a training constraint note rather than a shooting opportunity. Leah Hart set up at the 1,200-meter station and fired 11 rounds. Kellerman watched through his spotting scope from the range officer's position. The first round struck the 1,200-meter target within 0.8 MOA of center. In the prevailing conditions, 0.8 MOA at 1,200 meters was a statement. The second round struck within 0.6 MOA. The third at 0.5. By the seventh round, Kellerman had put down his spotting scope and was simply watching her with his unaided eye, because the scope had told him everything it was going to tell him and the rest was something different. She fired the 11th round, set the rifle down, stood, rolled her left shoulder twice, the only concession she made to the arm that had been broken, a habit the physical therapy team had noted and which was simply part of the inventory now. She turned and found Kellerman 4 meters behind her, watching her. "Where did you train?" he asked. She thought about the room at Fort Carson with the rain against the windows and the coffee going cold. She thought about Hannah Chen, 44 years old and composed and precise and completely unafraid of the weight she carried. "Under the best instructor I ever knew," she said. Kellerman looked at the 1,200-meter target through his scope for a long moment. 11 rounds within a 0.4 MOA composite group at 1,200 meters in January crosswind. He had been running this range for 11 years. He had seen 3 other shooters in 11 years do something in that neighborhood. 2 of them had been Special Forces snipers with competitive shooting backgrounds. One had been a Marine Scout sniper who had set an installation record that still stood. He nodded once. "Class starts tomorrow at 0700, he said. "Briefing room is Building C. They had 23 students." "I know," she said. She had read every record, every qualification score, every background note. The quiet, thorough inventory she could not stop keeping. Kellerman picked up her rifle case for her before she could reach it. Not because she could not carry it, because it was a gesture, the kind that requires nothing except the recognition that something has been settled. Maybe you have watched someone earn a room's respect in a single afternoon without saying more than 12 words. Maybe you have been that person, in your field, in your life, in the moment when what you know finally met what you could show. Drop a comment below and share that moment. Because Leah Hart's story is about the ridge and the tower and the rubble and the official reports. But it is also about this. About the flat January range and 11 rounds and a man who put down his scope because the scope had told him enough. Your moment matters too. Tell us about it. The briefing room in Building C held 23 students at 7 o'clock on January 7th. They were seated in 4 rows. The youngest was Private First Class Yusuf Amora, 20 years old, from Minneapolis, Minnesota, who had scored in the 94th percentile on every applicable aptitude assessment and had the expression of someone who was aware that he was the youngest person in the room and was working very hard to appear as though this was not information he was currently processing. He had a small photograph in the upper left corner of his notepad. His grandmother, Leah would later learn, who had raised him after his parents died in a traffic accident when he was 11, and who had told him the night before he shipped to Fort Carson that she expected him to come home knowing something true about himself. He was trying to be ready for that. Leah stood at the front of the room. She had the Beratum 17 on the table beside her, unloaded, its bolt open, its case beside it. She had placed beside the rifle one other object, a small notebook, navy blue cover, the kind purchased at any office supply store, its pages worn at the corners from handling. Hannah's notebook. It had been sent to her by the program's administrative record keeper 3 months after Hannah died, along with a personal effects inventory that listed 3 items, of which this was one. Leah had not opened it for 3 years. She had opened it once, at Walter Reed, in the amber afternoon light on the east bench, and had read it for 2 hours and then sat with it in the silence that followed, the kind of reading that changes the shape of what you know. She looked at the 23 students for a moment before she spoke. She looked at them the way a person looks at something they have come a long way to reach. Then she began. "My name is Staff Sergeant Leah Hart," she said. "Some of you will have heard other designations. They don't matter here. What matters here is what you can learn in the next 16 weeks and whether you have the patience to learn it correctly." She paused. She looked at the Barrett on the table. "A rifle is not a tool," she said. "I know that is how it is classified in every manual in this building and in every logistical system that accounts for it. But a tool is something you use and put down. What you will carry for the rest of your career after this course is not something you put down. It is something you take everywhere, including into the places inside yourself where most people don't bother to go." She looked at the notebook beside the rifle. "My instructor told me this on the 3rd day of my training, and I did not fully understand it until recently. I am telling it to you now because I want you to have it from the beginning, so you don't have to spend 3 years finding it the hard way." Yusuf Amora had stopped writing. He was simply watching her. "Every bullet changes the world," she said, and the words landed in the room with a specific weight they had always carried and which she was now, for the first time, delivering to people who needed to receive them rather than to the interior of her own unanswered grief. Small ways, large ways, but never in no way at all. You carry that weight or it carries you. There is no third option. She looked around the room. 23 people. 23 people who had come here for a qualification and were going to leave with something more difficult and more durable and more necessary. That weight, she said, is not a punishment. It is not a burden to minimize or manage or eventually escape. It is your purpose. It is the reason you will be thorough when tired. It is the reason you will recalculate when you are certain. It is the reason you will hesitate at the right moments and not at the wrong ones. It is the reason you will come home knowing something true about yourself. She had not planned that last sentence. It had arrived on its own, from somewhere she had not been looking. She thought, briefly, of a grandmother in Minneapolis who had said something very similar to a grandson who was now sitting in the 2nd row with a photograph in the corner of his notepad and an expression that said he had come a long way to hear something that would carry him the rest of his life. The morning light came through the briefing room's south-facing windows at an angle that was flat and January pale and very clear. She picked up Hannah's notebook. She did not open it. She held it the way you hold something that belongs to the part of you that cannot be inventoried. "Let's begin," she said. For the next 16 weeks, Leah Hart stood on the ranges of Fort Harrison in every weather the Indiana winter and early spring could produce and taught 23 soldiers how to hold a weight that would define them. She taught them elevation adjustment and windage calculation and the Coriolis correction at distances beyond 900 meters that most people thought was theoretical until they missed by exactly the amount the Earth's rotation required. She taught them reading vegetation movement for wind assessment, identifying the difference between a 9 and an 11 km/h breeze in the upper strata by the behavior of tree canopy at 600 meters. She taught them trigger control as a form of commitment, not the commitment to fire, but the commitment to be completely certain before you did, and to be completely committed once you were. She taught them in Hannah's voice, in Hannah's structure, but through her own 3 years, because the lesson had passed through those years and come out the other side changed in the way that anything changes when it passes through reality and emerges still true. On the final day of the course, March 23rd, at a temperature of 54 degrees Fahrenheit with a light southern wind at 7 km/h and a sky of the specific bright gray that precedes spring by about 1 day, all 23 students completed the final qualification exercise. 23 first-round hits at 1,100 meters within the required parameters. 23. The previous record for a Fort Harrison primary sniper qualification course was 19 first-round qualifiers in a class of 26. Master Sergeant Kellerman stood at the range officer's position and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. His expression said what it needed to say without his assistance. Leah stood at the range near end and watched 23 people write something true into themselves with 23 rounds of ammunition, and she felt the weight she carried, still there, still real, still exactly as heavy as it had always been, oriented finally, completely, in the direction it was always meant to face, in the direction of what comes next. On the last afternoon, after the students had returned to quarters and the range had been cleared and the equipment stowed in the armory, Leah sat alone at the 1,200-meter station on a simple wooden bench that someone had placed there years ago and which Kellerman had never removed because he believed that a range needed at least one place where a person could sit and look at distance without a weapon in their hands. She sat with Hannah's notebook in her lap. She watched the target frames at 1,200 meters in the failing afternoon light, pale rectangles against the tree line's dark notation marks. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. The air smelled of cold and turned earth and the first faint suggestion of something green beneath it. She opened the notebook. There was a page, the 43rd page, she had counted, that Hannah had filled with a single line repeated in varying sizes of handwriting, as though she had been testing it, measuring it, finding the scale at which it was most true. The line was the same each time. The size changed. The truth of it did not. The weight is the point. Leah read it once. Then she closed the notebook. She looked at the distance. 1,200 meters of flat cleared ground to a pale rectangle she could not fully see in this light, but knew was there because she had measured it herself, and the measurement did not change in the dark. Sergeant First Class Marcus Donovan was, at that precise moment, 9,243 kilometers away in Savannah, Georgia, reading a school drawing his daughter had brought home that day, a picture of a woman on top of something tall, in crayon, labeled in a 7-year-old's writing, the lady who saved Daddy's friends. He did not know how his daughter knew about this. He suspected she had heard something while pretending to be asleep, which was something she did. He put the drawing in his left chest pocket. Private First Class Yusuf Amora was writing a letter to his grandmother in Minneapolis, using the small notepad with a photograph in the corner. And the letter said many things, but the line she would underline later with a red pen and tape to her refrigerator door was, "I know something true about myself now, Grandma. I think I came here to find exactly this." Corporal Tanya Osei was at Fort Benning, fully recovered, requalified, training with a new platoon and carrying in her left cargo pocket a handwritten note that said, in handwriting she recognized as precise enough to be machine-printed, 27. Still counting. Never stop. The full accounting of what Leah Hart had done at Ember Ridge had been formally classified at the TSOSCI level and would not appear in public records. The 27 soldiers who had walked out through the creek bed knew what they knew. Donovan's 11-page report was sealed in a folder inside a building inside a classification architecture that most people would never navigate. None of that mattered, in the way that Leah had come to understand what mattered. The official record was for institutions. The true record was carried by people. 27 people were carrying a specific piece of the true record in the specific way that only people who have lived something can carry it, and they would carry it into every room and every conversation and every decision for the rest of their lives. And 23 more people had now walked out of Fort Harrison carrying something else. Something that had started with Hannah Chen in a room at Fort Carson with rain against the windows, and had traveled through 3 years of grief and a 41-day inventory catalog and a polymer rifle case and a 9-meter observation tower that had made its final decision on a morning in autumn, and had arrived here, on this bench, in this flat Indiana light, in the hands of a woman who had been 3 seconds too slow once, and who had spent 3 years inside that truth until she understood it completely and was ready to deliver it forward. She stood. She picked up the notebook. She picked up the rifle case. She walked back toward the building with the flat gray sky above her and the bare trees of the range far and standing like notation marks against the white. And she thought about Hannah, not with the specific ache she had carried for 3 years, but with the quiet, full presence that comes when grief has been processed into something permanent and purposeful. She thought about a lesson that had traveled from one person to another and was now traveling to 23 more and would travel from those 23 to every person they ever stood beside on a ridge or in a trench or in a briefing room with morning light coming through south-facing windows. The weight is the point. She carried it, and she was not done. If this story moved you, if something in these 2 parts landed in a place that is real and true for you, we want to hear from you right now. Drop a comment below and tell us what you are taking away from Leah Hart's story. Tell us which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the tower? Was it the 27? Was it Hannah's lesson? Was it the 23 students on the final day? Tell us. Because this channel exists because people like you show up and stay and carry these stories forward. And if you know someone who has been 3 seconds too slow at something and has not found their way back yet, share this with them. Not because it will fix anything, but because sometimes a story can be the exact weight a person needs to understand that what they are carrying was never meant to be set down. It was meant to be aimed. Like this video. Subscribe if you haven't. And leave a comment, because your words in this space are part of what makes the next story worth telling. We will see you for the next one.